Hi, everyone. Today, Jenna is here with us, partner of a family law firm, and she told me that she likes chai. So what we're tasting today is T Squared roasted apple chai. Jenna, what do you think about it?
It's hitting all the notes for me. It's a little oaky. It's chai-y.
Chai-y, oaky.
As a not connoisseur of tea, it's very good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I just thought that would be kind of fun. I love chai, and I really actually wanted to make you chai while we were going to have this conversation, but maybe next time.
Oh, fingers crossed. You know?
Thank you so much for joining us. I, really wanted to take this opportunity to kind of ask you, from my line of business, when I work with clients who are looking to rent, looking to buy, people who might be married, people who might not be married, but are looking to move in together. And, it becomes the birds are chirping and everybody's super happy until it's not.
That's how it goes. That's the nature of relationships in my experience.
In that field, with that idea and that experience, I've had to call you and be like, hi, can you help? And so I wanted to reach out to you because I wanted you to kind of share some of your knowledge as a family law lawyer who gets it from a finance perspective, who gets it from a family law perspective, a mediation type of thing. What can you tell us? But before we get there, please introduce yourself, because I know you're a kick butt lawyer and also someone who, you say you're a casual do-it-yourselfer, but really you actually do the plumbing and electricals, and then you're like, I'm done.
Yes. All right. Well, okay. My name is Jenna Beaton, and I run a law firm called Beaton, Burke, Young with two partners. And we do family law issues. So a lot of divorce, separation, property issues, parenting issues of all kinds. And so that's my day-to-day life and how I practice. We do litigation. We do mediation. So that means we're in court. We're also trying to negotiate out of court and find settlements for people that aren't about having the biggest fight of their lives. And then we offer other services like arbitration and parenting coordination, which are about helping people resolve disputes, maybe with them having their own lawyers, and we're helping to decide them for them. So we do lots of things, all within the area of family law. I personally do consider myself a casual, handy person. And so, I quite like working on renovations. It's like a family hobby of ours. And I did a bathroom recently with my family, and my uncle, who was staying with me to do it with me, walked by my room and said, I've never been so proud that you're my niece, because I just saw that the electrical code was on your bed and you have ABS plumbing lying on the floor of your room.
Oh, I love it. You're such a nerd on so many levels, and you own it. I love it. So, I think that's really great because you know how to do it. You know how to roll up your sleeves and get the job done. And, especially in your professional aspect of working with people who are going through really difficult times, right? I guess one of the things I wanted to talk to you about and why I invited you is realizing it is a reality that a lot of relationships don't always work out the way that people had intended. So as a value add to the people out there, to get to know who you are and what you do and how you do it by getting the job done, it's also, I think it would be really helpful. If you have some, what do you see that's common that people should think about before you move in together?
A ton. I see a ton. The most common thing that I would say that people sort of, your average person doesn't have an appreciation, is that people who are married and people who are not married do not get treated the same in the Ontario property division scheme. So if you have lived together for 20 years, you're still not the same as someone who has been married for 7.
Okay.
We have different rules, and lots of people go into living together or owning property or contributing to property, even that's not in their own name, unfortunately, without appreciating what it means to not be married and why that would matter or not. So that's a really big thing that we see. I'm happy to explain that. Maybe that's a little dull, but
no, that's important. Like, because I think people don't think about it. People are like, oh, marriage is antiquated. We don't need it. But you're not protected in the same way.
That's exactly right. And it's funny in Quebec, it's like marriage is not nearly as popular as a construct, I guess, whereas in Ontario, it's still quite popular. But I do agree with you that it seems to be on the decline. Like people are more interested in just living what we would call common law. And what is considered common law is like different in different types of law. Insurance is different than spousal support or alimony and is different than property. So if you're not married, you don't have quite the same rights. People who are married almost immediately after they get married have this right to share in any wealth that they together accumulate during the marriage. So in either of their names. And so most people think, oh, we're married, we're splitting everything 50-50. It's not quite that straightforward, but it is closer to that than not. And so what's like grown during the marriage does get shared. People who are not married don't have that default right at all. And they have to use what we call equitable claims or trust claims to say, I should get some of that property, that asset, that piece of real estate, whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be, that could be another type of asset, because I contributed to it in some manner. I made payments. I renovated that house. Maybe me and my family showed up. Who knows, you know? And so it's really important that people are aware of that difference, because if you're not married and you're making payments, it's just a really harder threshold to try to make sure that at the end of the day, you're getting a fair split of that property. Even if you might, in law, have a very good case, you're going to have to waste money on legal fees getting there. You're going to have to waste a lot of emotional labor to get there. Like it is very hard. And so what I say to people who aren't married is spend the time up front, talk to a lawyer. Whether you talk to a lawyer and you do what we call a cohabitation agreement or not, at least just be informed, because most people don't know how the law works and it's not that straightforward for people who aren't married.
Okay.
So very important that even if I don't go into exactly how it works, talking to a lawyer will be invaluable if you're about to live together.
And I think that here's the thing. People might be really scared to talk to a lawyer because people think that the fees are exorbitant. Like, I mean, getting trusts, getting wills, getting those type of things. But it's like such a basic staple that if you don't do it, you're not protecting yourself until when you find yourself in a situation and you're like, what? If I had done that, I could have saved myself probate and all of this stuff and things just being tied up in red tape. So, I mean, what can people, like, how does it work? How do fees work?
That's a great question. And you're quite right. People do stress out a lot about lawyers' fees, and with good reason at times. Sometimes lawyers are very expensive. It's probably you're consulting with them. So you're spending an hour, maybe 2 hours talking to them to get information, depending on how chatty you are, honestly. And that's just a lawyer's hourly rate. You don't have to pay a retainer typically up front. Certainly not most family lawyers do that. Yeah. And so if you're talking to me for an hour, my rate right now is $4.25. People's rates go up with time and inflation and such. But spending let's say $300 to $700, depending on what lawyer you're talking to. In Toronto specifically, that's like probably a reasonable estimate for most people. That's a very good investment compared to what you're going to pay on the back end having a fight. Because then you're paying a lawyer by the hour to write letters, to give you advice about, okay, now that I know all the facts, this is what I think, maybe there's research involved. It's just a lot more work. And so getting out in front of it, one, makes people think in their relationship about what they're doing, which, you know, some people will otherwise be like, oh, all my money went into the joint account and I don't have any personal savings and we're not married. And at the end of the day, you're like, wait, I don't get to share everything. That's really scary. But if you're, even without a contract, you're conscious of what you're doing up front, you might be like, okay, my income's going to go here. I'm going to share in a joint account over here so that I am saving for myself and I know how the law will work later and I can be a little more prepared. But talking to a lawyer up front could be as small as like a consultation fee. If you're doing like a domestic contract, like a cohabitation agreement or a marriage contract, which that's another popular thing that people should consider, that's a few $1,000s depending on how complex it is or how much you and your partner don't really agree about what should go in, right? Sometimes you have an idea. It's a hard topic to broach because it's what if we break up?
Yeah.
No one likes to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Except us practical pragmatics. And so if you were doing a lot of work, it gets a little more expensive, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a straightforward, a simple contract, I would say, is often better than a complex one.
Yeah.
So it's just upfront is always a less expensive investment than on the back end.
And I appreciate that, because I also think that having that, I find for me as someone who is a professional communicator, having tough conversations in advance helps a lot, because it's like, what's the process? What are we going to do? What are we thinking about? And a lot of people are like, I'm just along for the ride. And they have certain set of expectations that they may not have articulated.
Right.
They just made assumptions. And when you make an assumption and you don't clarify, that's when you get into these bumpy roads. And so I think that, you know, in this world where we see more and more people cohabitate, you know, I sometimes get it on the back end where people are like, yeah, we just bought a place together. We moved in. It's not working out. Now we got to leave. Right. We got to split. And they didn't have any agreements in place. Somebody put more, somebody put less, and it gets very contentious. And for me, as someone, when I am working with people, I try to be fair and I try to be reasonable to make sure that both parties get something, you know, respective, relevant to the situation. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I need Jenna. I need to talk to Jenna about like, what can people do to prepare for that?
That's a good question. So one, the thing I already said, like being proactive beforehand. And I will say, like, a lot of people, not kind of what you just described there, I actually find that a lot of people do split up because they're not aligned in like financial values. That's not every reason, but like there's a pretty big percentage that's like one of you is a big spender and one of you is not. And you didn't really have a conversation about money at the front because it's taboo or it's awkward, whatever the reason. And like that is a fairly avoidable problem to like get that insight up front.
Yeah.
When you're at the point of separating and you are maybe having to sell a place, again, you're still probably needing to talk to a lawyer unless you have a contract and it's quite clear. And preparing for sale is sometimes contentious depending on how people are about it. The good news is if you are a joint owner of a property, you typically have a right to sell the property. And so if your name is on title, it is easier in like my world for me to help you sell. Someone who's not on title has a much harder time. Again, that's back to like, if you weren't looking ahead and maybe you're not married and you contributed money, but you didn't put your name on title, you might have a really hard time getting your value out of that house because you can't even force a sale. At least a joint owner, maybe we're fighting about who put how much in, can cause the sale, which gets the proceeds moving, which then makes everyone feel the pressure of wanting to settle and come up with a solution that works. Obviously, not everyone wants to sell their family home. And so that also can create a fair amount of like pressure for people. I don't know if I can ask you a question.
Yeah, of course. Ask me a question. Okay. Please, go for it.
Here we go. So in my business, as you would imagine, a lot of time we are selling a house and we have spouses who don't like to communicate. So do you typically, like, do you find you act for separating spouses, both of them, or do you do a lot of co-listing? Like, I find I'm getting more into people refusing to share an agent and doing co-listing. Like, what are you running into?
Co-listing.
You are?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, I think it is people feeling as though, am I getting that representation? And then having the conversation about, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to split? But, and people feeling like I want to have my person at the table, right? And then so we say, okay, let's work together to try and make this and bridge be the bridge to communicate with each other and to work with each other.
You and the other agent, you mean?
Yeah. And I mean, it's also about being very clear about, hey, what are you going to be responsible for? Or is it a referral fee? Or what does that mean? Like,
right.
So it's really, I think in all of these situations, whatever those dynamics are, it's having a clear outline so that both sides understand what are we expecting? What are we expecting with two agents working? Like, so if
right.
one agent is working for the other person, one agent is working for the other, how are we going to work together? Because at the end of the day, we want to represent the clients and their best interest. So it comes down to communication.
I can see that being very heavy on your work, like in terms of the amount of communication. Do you act when there's two spouses, like who are separating, and you'll be the single agent?
You know what? That's one of these things where, yes. And that's about having a conversation. I find for me, I want to have everybody on the same page so nobody feels like, oh, you're too much with one person or too much the other.
Right.
So what I try to do is just keep the communication very clear, keep both people in the communication chain. Like, so
like an email all together.
An email all together so that no one feels like they're
You're
not
siding.
a part of it. Like, I feel like it's almost like you're in therapy.
Yeah.
And when you're in therapy and you go into couples therapy, that the therapist doesn't like go off with one person and be like, oh, la, 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 la. And you're like, wait a minute, what did you say to that person? And it creates that doubt. It's about creating trust.
Right.
At the end of the day, whether you're in a relationship with, like one party or with both parties, whether it's like a separation or just like, hey, we want to buy a house together, it doesn't matter. It always comes down to trust. And I try to, for me personally, I try to create a situation where everybody feels safe. Like as, my code of conduct is something that people can feel comfortable knowing, like, yeah, I'm sending the same message to one or to both. Well, I mean, so if it's a couple or like two people, two parties.
Individually or together,
right? So I think communication is key. Clarity is key. And it's awkward too, right? Because it's kind of trying to be fair, trying to be reasonable, and trying to not feel like you're preferencing one over the other, right? And I feel like even when you think about working with a marriage counselor, or a therapist, that's what they try to do, is find a balance between it. And the thing is, real estate, as transactional as it can be, is very emotional in the best of times. And so in the worst of times, for me, really, I'm always like, no, I can't sell your house until you are clear about how the proceeds will be divided or what will happen with the sale. It's not like, okay, let's just get up to like selling the house. It's like, let's get to the point of playing it out. What does it look like? I don't know. What do you find?
That's funny. I would say that sometimes I need the sale to take place for people to like sit down at the table with me and talk about how we're going to divide. Like sometimes the sale is the event that then creates pressure so that people are like, okay, well, I actually need those proceeds. I got to rent a place. I got to buy a place and I need to get going. And so I need to do it before the closing date. Like sometimes I find that is quite a useful tool to me as opposed to people being good about dividing it in advance. Now, in a perfect
but wouldn't
world,
they have a conversation though? Like, don't you
Sometimes.
find because I know there have been situations where the relationship is no longer functioning and one person, both people are entitled and own the property and one person's like, I'm out. I need this place to be sold so I can rent or buy a new place.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, what do you do?
It's a good point. So something you say about that it depends how complex the file is, right? If you have people who are both professionals and they have good incomes, less fussed about the proceeds. But if you have a family and there's children, for instance, or maybe you have one partner who's not working, a really common problem that we have is someone says, I want to sell the house. And then the other person says, well, then I need support because, and you must run into this constantly, typically what I would refer to as a recipient, the person who might be entitled to support or need help with cash flow, can't get a mortgage or can't get rent without a separation agreement.
Yes.
Which is my world. And so they're like, we could sell the house, but I can't live anywhere if we do that. So if that problem comes up not infrequently, less with people without children, but so you need to have, in those situations, an agreement in place. Otherwise, one person is in deep trouble by the time you've sold, which goes to your point about you need to have a plan in advance.
Because I think that's just being prudent, right? About well, what happens if you sell it? Because that is the situation that you just spoke of is quite common, right? It's not always people coming in with equal financial strength, because someone who is taking care of the kids is doing a very valuable job that's not necessarily enumerated in a way that people value.
Yes.
And what does that look like? And I've seen, there's so many stories and they're so personal, and it's such an emotional state that people are like, I find that sometimes when I talk to people and they're in a state of separation or divorce or things just aren't going the right way, they're not thinking clearly as well. They're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was like, okay, Jenna, we need to have this conversation, because what can people do where they can at least have time to process? Like, what do we need to do? What are the steps of, learning about what your options are? What should you do? And I think step one is, it is worth if you're in a state of, crisis, or you're in a state of life turmoil and things are falling apart. You're like, I don't even know. I just need to survive. I think we've established that it's important to reach out to someone, reach out to a professional. Do you think, now some people are in a situation where they may not be high earners or have the funds. And so that's the piece about the fee piece. Do you think that there are alternative routes that people can do so that by the time they come to a lawyer, they're more clear in sort of what they
having a little information? Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say even someone who feels like the financially vulnerable party will need a lawyer at some point. And the reality is, even if you feel financially vulnerable, there is likely, for almost all of those cases, some way that you are going to be getting money, property division, a support arrangement, something. And so oftentimes that person will be able to either take funds from a line of credit or something to have a bit of security up front, or from a bank account and say, we're going to account for this later, but I just need to have a little money so that I can speak with someone and get resources. A lawyer seems somewhat inevitable in those situations, but something I've been running into lately is divorce is not necessarily intended because it's for people who aren't married, but it's like a coach. And I work not infrequently with a woman who is like a divorce coach effectively. And she is really good at sort of bridging the gap between a therapeutic assist when it's really stressful, you feel like you don't know where to turn. And then that person also has a really good understanding of how we're going to navigate getting to a lawyer, which lawyer to pick, how that lawyer is going to suit you.
Yes.
And how we're going to talk to the lawyer, making sure that emails are efficient as opposed to a very emotional diatribe. And so her business is called Lifeline Coaching.
Okay.
I'm sure there are others, but I actually really think she's fabulous at what she does. Her name's Stacey Mendelson. And she is so good at helping people say, okay, I hear all of that. I'm distilling it now into these points. And she'll meet with the lawyer with them and say, okay, here's your homework. Go do it. And there is a cost to it, but I would say the cost savings on the legal side alone justify an expense. And so there's resources like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, that one's not free. There are information clinics at courthouses that you can go to.
Okay.
That's not that easy to navigate as someone who's not part of the legal world. So I wouldn't say that's an easy way to get in. Mm-hmm. There's a lot online, but again, you won't know what's information and misinformation. Yeah. So that can be very hard. But I think another common thing is talking to other people who've gone through it. So your situation won't always be the same as someone else, but I do find that people will say to me, I talked to my friend and she had this, and I'll be like, well, here's your distinction, but the other thing they said is true. And so there is something to that, to having a support network that maybe isn't your family, but someone you could talk to who is going to say, oh, I had a good experience here. I liked this lawyer. That person was more affordable, whatever. They're not going to give you legal advice, but it's just a good way to help deal with some of the emotional content before you're talking to a professional.
Yeah.
And being able to find the right professional.
Well, this is the thing about finding the right fit, and which is why I was like, oh, I'd love to chat with Jenna more, because that gives people an opportunity to know you and not feel the pressure cooker.
Right.
If they're in a tough situation of every 15 minutes I'm being billed. I remember the first time I ever dealt with a lawyer when I was helping my mother build out her business, and I had to get a real estate lawyer, and I didn't know. And they're like, they bill you every 15 minutes. I would try to keep everything really tight and efficient. And so one of the things when it comes to engaging with lawyers is understanding how to engage in an effective manner. And you had mentioned this, when you write an email, and from a communications perspective, be clear about your purpose. What do you want? Why are you engaging with the lawyer? What is it that you need, right? What do you hope for as an outcome, or provide a context? I don't know. What is helpful in terms of like streamlining it? Because I know sometimes when people reach out to me and they're in a state of crisis or a situation where they're like, I know I need help. I don't know. I need to sell this house and blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, everything's on the page. And I'm like, what do you need? And I'm very honest. I'm like, we need to step back for a moment. The first solution may not be to sell the house. Maybe maybe it's finding a new place to live. Like, let's just take a moment and step back, right? Because I think it's about putting the client's needs first, and that's the most important thing. So when someone reaches out to you, what is helpful?
There is nothing I love more than an email from a client that is like organized and brief and point first. Like, I love when a client says to me, here's 6 bullets of things that have happened that you probably care about. I can expand on them if these are relevant. Here are the 5 questions I want to talk to you about. Can we have a call? And like, if I know what they're looking for, that is so helpful to be able to like, okay, 3 and 4 aren't applicable to you. Let's go through them quickly, but they don't matter. Let's talk about this. This is the big thing. The other thing is, which you tapped on already, is often clients don't even know what they need or what they don't know, which is what our job is, to say, okay, well, you highlighted this, but we actually have to look over here to this problem.
Yeah.
You want to sell the house? First, we have to make sure that you are going to have financial security before you're trying to look for a new place to live.
Yeah.
And so we have to do things in a different order than like an emotional response is asking people to like move, right? They're going to go and say, okay, I got to get out of this situation. And I'll say, well, if you leave and you rent, maybe you have the funds and you rent another place, what is the rent of that place saying about your ability to pay for it? And so like sometimes strategically, a quick move without like thinking ahead can have a negative consequence in my legal world.
So, I mean, and that's really important. And the other thing I was just thinking about as you were speaking was process, timelines. When a person is at a point of like, okay, this relationship isn't working out, I need to leave, or I need to like, sell my place. In terms of coming up with a separation agreement, in terms of making sure that pieces are in place to ensure a fair settlement or a fair division of assets and how things would be allocated, it doesn't happen overnight.
It does not. That's correct. Yes, most people do want to like get going right away, which I'm all for to some extent, but quickly everyone does get bogged down. Between the emotional toll of doing a separation and just the gathering of information, typically financial information, it really slows as you go, even for an organized person. So process is dependent, one, on like the parties, right? You could have very litigious people and I could want so badly to try and help you mediate. But if the other side is going to be very, very rigid or difficult, we're going to waste money and time in mediation. So you have to play your audience a bit.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, context. It's all context.
Sometimes one person can drive the process, which not always a great thing, but just the reality you have to work with. And timing depends on the people. So, and sometimes only one of them, but typically people will say, how fast can I get this done? And I would say, depends how fast you can move. Because most people's first step when they separate, unless it's a purely parenting case, I'm going to say, I need all this financial information from you. It's either part of property division or it's part of a support issue. And you have to go get me your tax returns and lists of your assets and all your bank account statements for this date. And that takes a long time and it's very daunting. And that is
overwhelming, right?
It's very overwhelming. Again, that's like a good place if you have a support person, paid or a family member who can help you, just someone to help you gather all these things, fill out these forms that we have to do. Like lawyers can help do it. But again, like I'm pretty cost conscious as a lawyer, I would say. And I try to say to a client, here's what you have to do. I can help you with as much of it as you want. But if you don't want to pay me, I quite respect that. Have someone help you with it. Here's what you're going to do. Here's your instructions. Do what you can. Okay. And then we'll check in just to help people minimize costs. Because I know no matter who you are, the cost of a lawyer weighs on you. And so I don't like to take on too much if the person's willing to do it.
Yeah.
That said, people's separation process is driven by them. It's pretty, unless you're like amicable and you guys know what you want to do and we're wrapping it up in a couple months, most people take a year. If you're in litigation, you'll take 2 years. Like, it's just a
timing is not fast.
It is not fast. It is not fast. And it's just one person does their finances. The other person's a bit behind. They didn't do their taxes yet, so they have to wait to do that. Like, it's not that it's actually a slow process. We could probably do it all in 2 weeks if everyone was like really on it.
But the reality,
that's just not how our lives work. And also, you better have nothing else going on, that you can just answer my emails and fill out forms, and that's not life. So it does take a long time, which people are always surprised to hear.
Yeah.
But again, if you want to drive a faster process, you can typically.
Well, I think that that's really helpful, because I find that when people are dealing with, challenging life circumstances, it's a moment of crisis and people are like, I want it done right now. And I'm like, whoa, let's step back for a moment. And I think what I'm hearing is, and what I've shared with clients is this isn't going to be a fast process, because even when I have couples who are separating, I'll have an initial conversation with them like 6 months, maybe 8, 9, 10 months, and then going, okay, so where are we now? Let's just do a check-in, right? Because the process does take long. And I think about the first time I get the call and I'm like, okay, no, we're not like going tomorrow and just putting the house up for sale. Like, there's a few things that we have to do. And that's why I was like, this is a really important conversation. And for people to understand, like, if I'm going through a big life-changing moment, that there are, supports that are in place, ways to kind of refine and think about what I have to do to ensure that I'm moving forward in a more stable and secure manner, and having housing is important, and how to plan for that. Right. And so that's why I was like, this is such an important conversation. And even when you started with what's the difference between cohabitation and what's the difference between marriage and the division of assets, and having that conversation up front. And even people who are like, I can only contribute X amount of money, and it's a portion, like maybe 30% versus 50%. How do you capture that and make sure there's a paper trail so that in the future, should anything happen, you have that documentation? And I think, so I used to work for the Attorney General and I used to work for legal aid. And I remember documentation.
We love paperwork. It feels like.
Right. And I think even, like when it comes to mortgages, like when people are getting their mortgages, it's documentation. Where did the money come from? We got to be able to trace it. And so I always advise people, like, please, like, document and clearly state your intention or be explicit about it so that whatever happens, it is documented.
Yes. So that's an interesting thing that you bring up. I actually just, when I did, married people are different than unmarried people. I just really talked about unmarried people. But married people, there's actually like quite a few things that I wish people knew about and what it means.
Tell me, lay it on.
So like a really common one is because married people do this scheme that we call it equalization of net family property, which is a lot of buzzwords that just mean we're sharing the growth during the marriage.
Equalization means we're sharing.
That's right. And so because of that, what you bring into the marriage, you kind of get credit for that. So if you are worth $5 at the start of the marriage and at the end of the marriage, you're worth, I hate that I picked an odd number, but
go with $9. Let's say you're worth $10.
That number. Fine, we'll do 10. If you started with 10 and then at the end you're worth 18, you grew by $8. So you're sharing your $8 with your spouse, and maybe they only grew by $6, let's say. Okay. You're going to give them $1 because you both want to leave with getting $7 from the marriage, because that's how much you collectively grew by 14.
So 8 minus 6 is $2. So you split it and it's $1 each. Is that how
or
it
you
works?
could 8 plus 6 divided by 2.
Okay, got it. 8 plus 6 divided by 2. Follow the math.
And so it's about how much you grow, right? So the person who grew by 6, they might have started with 100 instead of 10, right? And so the thing that's important for people who are married is what you bring in, you kind of get a little bit of credit for that. And you have to share any growth on that money, but it gets acknowledged what you bring in. So like a very important thing that people don't know is I wish people who were married, when they got married, kept records of all their assets. That would be so valuable to you at the end. If you're in a long marriage and banks don't keep records for more than 7 years, depending on your bank, you don't have records of what your RSP was worth or your TFSA or
it's really valuable.
It's so valuable. So like some people have financial planners and we talk to them all the time and say, you should keep it for people. Keep their date of marriage records for them, just in case. You don't have to talk about it. Like,
wow.
It's just a value add because you can't often get those records later and they're really important.
Wow. Okay. That I didn't know.
Piping hot really like true. The tea. So second thing I would say is the house that you live in, if you're married at the date of separation, like when you separate, that house that you're in is special. We call it a matrimonial home is the word. And if you owned the matrimonial home, like let's say you and I are married and on the date of marriage, you owned the house that we live in, you won't get credit for bringing that into the marriage.
Because we are married and it's 50-50.
And so that house, you have to share it with me. Because the premise of that, like going back to why they made the legislation is like the house is most people's main asset and we don't want one person to be contributing and maintaining a house through the whole marriage and they don't get anything for it or they only get a bit of growth.
Yeah.
And there's a good reason for it, but it's something to watch out for. If you're coming into the marriage with a home, you should talk to a lawyer. Because if you are going to move into that house, you might have a pretty negative financial consequence that you don't appreciate is coming. And you'll be really frustrated when you have $1 million house and you pay off the mortgage and you're giving away half, but you had only, 200 grand of equity when you started or something like that.
Yes. And that is actually a true case in point that I know of. That's really important. So just let me clarify something.
Yeah.
Prenups.
Yeah.
So do you think that's important? Like, because we talked about like when you get it married, that you split everything 50-50. And so like whatever you brought in. So I think the lesson here is document what you bring in before you get married.
Correct.
So that you have a baseline.
Yes, exactly.
Do you need a prenup?
Some people do. Not everyone does. You have to think about what you want it for. So people who are married, we have like a scheme that's easier to follow, unlike the poor unmarried people who don't have so much clarity. That said, it still operates sometime in a way that's like not great for people. So a really common thing we do prenups, or we call them marriage contracts in Canada, for is to change that home issue I just explained, where like you don't get credit for it. That's a really common one. We say, I want credit that I brought in the home.
Yeah.
Because if I had sold my house and put it in an investment account, I would have gotten credit for it.
You get an appraisal.
Right. But if you don't do a prenup, you're not going to get credit for that house. And so you can change the law on those issues if you guys agree. And so that's like a really important rule that you can work around if you know about it. It's just that most people don't. So there's lots of reasons to do marriage contracts. That's not the only one. It's just a very, very common, a very simple one. Another thing that people do marriage contracts for is if they have an asset, a business, a bank account, a whatever, a house, they want to say, I never want to have to share that. Even if it grows, I don't want to share the growth. I want this asset protected and it's mine, and you can have your asset protected, or maybe you don't have something.
Yeah.
And that we can like alter how the law will work with a marriage contract.
Protect yourself, right?
You got to look out. You got to look ahead. And so like that's, if you have family who have money, it's like a common thing that people are looking for, or you're the beneficiary of a trust if you're lucky. You're trying to make sure that those things aren't later going to have to be shared if they weren't really ever intended for the family. But
it's really powerful. Like that's really great advice, right? Like I honestly just didn't think about like before you get married, document what you had coming into it, right? And so it's good.
No cost. You can do it yourself. Just put it in an envelope.
Yeah.
Put it in your email. Anywhere. Keep these documents is so valuable. Obviously, it doesn't feel good to think about the worst case, but like we have to be a bit practical.
I know. And sometimes, oh no, I don't worry. We'll be fine. Right. And I think that there are those moral, like,
yes. No, you're right.
Like judgments.
People don't want to, like a lot of people find a marriage contract is like a kiss of death. Like, I'm not thinking about our separation before we even get married.
Yeah.
What a sad thought. But I wouldn't be in business if people didn't sometimes have an outcome they didn't expect.
Right. Well, that's really important. One of the things that I had asked you was for your quote, and I love it because my daughter loves Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so I'm going to read it because it's really great. And I just kind of want you to speak to it after I say it. We're just, dissents speak to a future age. It's not simple to say my colleagues are wrong and I would do it this way. But the greatest dissents do become court opinions, and gradually over time, their views become the dominant view, so that the dissenters hope that they are writing not for today, but for tomorrow. RBG.
She's notorious.
Yes.
Yeah, I picked it and I was like, I feel very basic. I feel like everyone likes Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but I really like this quote. So first I'll explain a dissent, in case not everyone knows what that is. In the court world, when you have a decision by judges and you get into the higher levels of court, so Court of Appeal, or in Canada, the Supreme Court, you have many judges hearing a case. And it works by majority rules. So sometimes you'll have 3 judges in the Court of Appeal, and 2 of them will agree with your case, and one of them says, I actually don't agree, and I think it should go the other way. And that's what we call a dissent. When one person has a different, or sometimes many of the judges, because Supreme Court has 9, so several of the judges will say, no, that's wrong. We think it's this way. The law moves with dissents, I feel. And so sometimes you will see someone, especially on like equality issues, you will have a dissent that isn't so popular at the time that it's made. But later that dissent gets used, just as she says in the quote, like over and over, and it becomes the law. And it's like, we saw that in the abortion case law in Canada. And you see it all the time, honestly, but it's just, I really like that there's something about the sort of underdog. And it's how minorities often work. They're not heard for a long time. And so until there's a change and an evolution in our society. And I really like that about the way she captured that.
Totally. I love it. Really I'm all about the underdog. I feel like the underdog most of the time. But I feel like, I really appreciate the people who have the courage to speak up, and the people who find the courage to continue to do it when it's really difficult. And I just think it's so awesome. Like, I really appreciate you coming and spending time to share your knowledge. And I'm sure this isn't going to be the last time.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I mean, I hope I didn't bore you too much with the law, but
no, the law is important. Like, it is fundamentally one of the things that a lot of people don't, they don't think about it, and it's hindsight, and they're like, oh, I should have. And I would have.
Right.
And I could have. And then they're like, now I'm faced with all these issues. So at least this gives us a sliver of insight into some basic things that people should do.
Yeah. Well, I hope it helps.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jenna.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Take care.